Hi everyone and happy new year. Welcome to 2025. I'm sending you my very best wishes for the year ahead. May the year bring you lots of amazing books. I'm excited today because I'm going to be looking back at the year gone by and sharing with you my favourite books of 2024. They all happen to be classics, so this also counts as my favourite classics of 2024. During the year I read around 25 books, which definitely isn't one of my best reading years. In fact, it's probably one of the years where I have read the least, but instead of novels and other types of book, I was instead reading a lot of academic articles, journals and that kind of thing because of my university degree. That is probably also going to be the case in 2025 for quite a big part of it, but what I did read in 2024 I really loved, so it was a year of quality over quantity. Let's get into it and talk about the books that I have very carefully chosen. Because I've got 5 favourites this year, I'm gonna go in order from least favourite to favourite, and do stick around to the end because I really want to fangirl about my favourite book of the year, and it's a book that you probably haven't heard of, so you're going to want to hear about it. In 5th place we have The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, a book that it is very difficult to talk about without spoiling it for you because there is so much in this book that I could give away and that would ruin your reading experience if you want to read it. But what I can say is that this is one of Agatha Christie's Poirot mysteries. It's the first one where I really felt like I connected with Poirot, where I felt like he had a story within the book and that we got to know stuff about him that added to his character. He's not just the detective, he becomes more of a person. As the title of this one gives away, at the centre of the book is the murder of a man called Roger Ackroyd, and before his death he became aware of a blackmail plot. He was sent a letter where this was revealed, but before he could read the end and before he could tell our narrator, Dr. Shepherd, who was behind this blackmail, he dies. So clearly somebody wants to cover this up. It's set within a small village community where everybody knows each other, which is the type of setting that Agatha Christie writes best. She deals with that network of people, that gossip network, so brilliantly. And Roger Ackroyd himself is quite a big character within that community, but also owns a very big house that his family are all visiting and live in. And at the time of his murder, in his study, everybody else is in the house but his study is locked. So part of the mystery is working out who has done it, but also how it has taken place. I'm not going to say anything more about the plot because I feel like I'm treading on eggshells, not giving something away. I just really want you all to read it for yourselves, and I think that if you haven't read any Agatha Christie before, this would be a great place to start. I feel like once you read this, you'll get Agatha Christie so perfectly because it sums up why she was so good at what she did. I feel pretty clever because I worked out who did it as I was reading it. I just didn't quite work out all the steps along the way. There are lots of clues that you might pick up on, but you probably won't, and then you'll kick yourself because you'll just think, how did I miss that? In 4th place we have To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. I don't have a favourite Virginia Woolf novel because I love them all so much for so many different reasons, but if I did, this would have to be up there because it changed me. It really did. It was one of those books that I read and I read it at the right time and it made me think, and it's a book that I know that I will go back to throughout my life and I'll get something new from it. It's set in the Isle of Skye in Scotland, where the Ramsays have a holiday home where they are visiting and they have invited people to, and we meet them at various points in their life as they centre around this one place and a lighthouse that they want to visit. Because we are following the Ramsays and their visitors at various points in their lives, and because we have events like the First World War taking place, they are touched throughout the narrative by loss, by grief, by change, by big life events, which we experience with them emotionally. And sometimes those can be big things, sometimes they can be these very big emotions at a very small moment in their lives, and so we get very different scales, very different perspectives, and sometimes the stream of conscious narrative can feel like you're on a boat out in the middle of the ocean rocking about, and at points you feel like you've reached a place of calm, and that's how it best captures how human thought works and how human feeling works too. I mentioned one of my favourite parts in a previous video, but it's worth reading to you again. Virginia Woolf writes, "For now, she need not think about anybody. She could be herself by herself. And that was what now she often felt the need of. To think, well, not even to think. To be silent, to be alone. All the being and the doing, expansive, glittering, vocal, evaporated. And one shrunk with a sense of solemnity to being oneself, a wedge-shaped core of darkness, something invisible to others." I loved this so much more than I ever thought possible, and I know that I will continue to love it, and perhaps even love it more than I already do. And for that reason, now I really properly think about it, it might have to become my favourite Virginia Woolf novel. In third place, we have Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh, and I loved everything about this. I've been meaning to read it for years, and then as soon as I started reading it, I was so glad I was reading it at that point, but I was kicking myself because there was a book out there that I could have adored and loved, and I was just sitting on it for so long. This is another one where it feels so difficult to describe the ways that I loved it, because I loved it so much that as I was reading it I was so absorbed. I was living in the world, and the feelings, the emotions in this book felt so strong that I felt like I was living it alongside the characters. It's set before the Second World War, and our narrator Charles Ryder is born into a relatively privileged position in which he can interact in privileged circles. He goes to Oxford University, for example. He comes from money, but he doesn't necessarily have the bloodline to match, and he becomes best friends but also becomes infatuated, besotted with Sebastian Flight, whose family are the total opposite. They are mega rich, they are mega wealthy, they're mega privileged, they have the landed estate, they are of the gentry, and that's definitely not a world that Charles knows. And so as he becomes deeper involved with the Flights, it's a world that he gets to know and that he becomes obsessed with, and that he changes himself to fit in with. There's a mega homoerotic subtext to this where you basically just sort of want to shout at Sebastian and Charles, like, just kiss already throughout. Like, it feels like fan fiction should be written about these two. Like, nowadays if it was published you definitely would have that, but it's so casually done in this book that it made me think a lot while I was reading it about the picture of Dorian Gray and how much had changed in the 50 or 60 years between the two being published, because I don't think that Oscar Wilde would have got away with writing a book like this. But at the same time it also made me think about Morris by E.M. Forster, which in many ways feels like the same book. I wondered as I was reading this if Evelyn Waugh had read Morris, and then I realised Morris wasn't published until the 1970s, so he can't have done, yet they feel like they could be in conversation with each other. I fell deeply in love with the setting of Brideshead, which is this beautiful country estate. In my head it was very much like Stourhead in Wiltshire. That was how I imagined it, with its beautiful lake, and I loved the sense of longing for a place which very much reflected longing for people as well. It's one I'm going to sit with and we'll definitely talk about more. In second place we have Summer by Edith Wharton. I loved every second of reading this book too, and even though it's a relatively short book, it felt like I just lived and breathed it, so it felt so much longer in the best possible way. This is set in an isolated rural community in New England, very different from Edith Wharton's usual settings of grand, magnificent New York, but I loved it for that reason, because you'd never think that a writer could produce two extremes and yet do both so well. Our main character is Charity Royal, who was adopted as a child, who's been brought up by a man in the main village, but she's grown up knowing that she's from a community of outcasts who live far away up in the mountain. She gets to know a young architect from New York, which is seen as a faraway alien planet in comparison to where she lives. On the surface, that might seem like the perfect recipe for a happily ever after, but actually that's not the reality. You think that Lucius Harney will be the perfect partner, but he reminds me a lot of Angel Clare in Tess the D'Urbervilles, where you think he's an angel, but really there's a lot more going on there. A lot more complexity, a lot more layers to break down. And I loved that my perception of all the characters kept changing as I was reading. A great place to start if you've never read any Edith Wharton. And now, please start playing the drum roll. We have my favourite book of 2024. In first place, we have Jill by Amy Dillwyn. This is not a book that I thought was going to be my favourite book of the year. In fact, even after I finished reading it, I didn't think it was going to be my favourite. And then I just could not stop thinking about it. I became obsessed with it. And it's not the best book ever written, but I still loved it. I love everything that it stands for. I loved the experience I had when reading it. It was so much fun, and it also breaks every mould of what a Victorian book should be. And I love it for that reason. This book is bonkers, by the way, but that's what makes it so brilliant. So about Jill. This was published in 1884. Amy Dillwyn is a Welsh writer, but she grew up in London, for example, attended the London season, and she was involved in very fashionable circles. The thing about Jill that makes it stand out is that it is a proudly, openly sapphic story. Our main character, Jill, falls in love with women in the book, with one woman in particular, and the story was heavily inspired by Amy Dillwyn's own unrequited love for a woman she called her wife, but who didn't love her back. At the beginning, you think that Jill is the perfect Cinderella type story. It's about this girl called Gilbertina who grows up relatively wealthy. She's part of the gentry. Like Amy Dillwyn, she mixed in fashionable circles. As a teenager, she became infatuated with a girl called Kitty, who's basically the most beautiful woman she's ever seen in her life. But when Gilbertina's father remarries, when he marries her new stepmother, Gilbertina gets pushed aside. Cinderella, right? Except Gilbertina breaks the fourth wall, and as she's about to run away to start a new life for herself, she says, "I resolved not to stand this treatment any longer. It became evident to me that her ladyship destined me to play the part of Cinderella. As I had no fancy for that role, and as I had not a fairy godmother to come to my assistance, I must take the matter into my own hands and act fairy godmother for myself." So she runs away from home, sets up life as a lady's maid, and there she enters the household of Kitty, the woman that she's been in love with for many years. In so many places, this book is super melodramatic, especially in the second half. There are some things that happen that you just will never believe. Like, even at the beginning of the chapter, from beginning to end, you just do not know what's gonna happen. And I loved that because it was so wild. But it's also really funny for that reason. There's a lot to love about Jill as a character. She definitely is an anti-heroine, but she's very, very clear that's what she is. Like, she doesn't profess to be a likeable person. She does some very questionable things, but she's sort of doing it for a higher purpose, and so she kind of gets away with it. There are whole paragraphs with her swooning over women, talking about how beautiful, how pretty, how like amazing they are, which I just loved. I loved how unashamed it was and how it embraces something that is completely natural, but at the time would have been seen as, and was seen as, unnatural. I basically want everybody in the world to read this because I want to be able to talk about it in all its spoilery glory, but I'm aware that not a lot of people have read it. Read Jill, please, so we can all have a Jill book club. Like, I need that in my life. So those were my favourite classics of 2024. I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and I would love to know in the comments what your favourite books of the year were. I'm looking forward to making lots more videos in 2025. I hope you'll follow along with me. Happy reading!